One of the strangest, most bizarre passages in the New Testament is arguably found in 1 Peter chapter 3, 18 through 20. I'm going to read it, then I got to get your take on this, Eric. It says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water."
Did Jesus really descend into hell? Or is that just a medieval myth stemming from antiquated creeds? In 1 Peter 3, Peter says Christ proclaimed to the spirits in prison. The Apostles' Creed interprets that he descended into hell. The church fathers assumed this basic meaning, and Hebrews is clear. You die once, and then judgment. No second chances. But many today reject one part or another of this interpretation. I want to take a look today at Dr. Erik Thoennes' argument on the Sean McDowell Show in just a quick second. But first, if you like discussing the enchanted corners of the Bible, please like and subscribe, but also head over to anthonydelgado.net and check out my books, articles, and other free materials, and grab a free gift over there for signing up for my mailing list. Okay, here's the clip I wanted to comment on.
Now, this raises probably 5,000 questions, but before we get to your take on this passage, what are maybe 2 or 3 different ways people take this, in particular what it means to proclaim to the spirits in prison?
Right, yes. So, yeah, this is a really challenging passage. And like every passage, we need to back up and ask, what's the big picture that Peter is after? What's he trying to accomplish in this passage? And he's trying to basically here encourage persecuted believers. He's trying to bring patient endurance, faithfulness for the long haul. And so keeping that in mind is so important when you understand this. And it's easy to get in all kinds of speculative things, forgetting his goal. His goal is to encourage struggling, persecuted, weary believers. And so he gives a beautiful gospel verse where he just lays out the gospel in a beautiful way, that Christ suffered once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. That's the purpose. So that's the core encouragement for believers, to understand what this means. And there are lots of ways people have sought to understand this. One of them is, well, it sounds like Jesus, maybe during the 3 days of his intermediate state between death and resurrection, went to hell and gave people in hell a second chance.
So prison would be hell in that case.
Prison would be hell. And the Noah imagery is just a way of talking about even people who didn't return to God had a second chance and that sort of thing. And I think that's really missing the point of this passage. So there are lots of different ways people have approached it, trying to figure out what it means, the descent into hell that actually got a lot of literal overstatement in the early church. But I think what's important to realize is that he's encouraging persecuted believers. And so I think he's using the idea of Noah's time to get us to this idea of Noah being a persecuted believer. There are all sorts of resistance to him. He's this minority follower of God who is getting massive oppression and pushback and mockery from the people of his day as he's warning them of the judgment to come. And so he's preaching the truth and getting all sorts of oppression because of it, and he's the lone voice in the midst of it. So he's wanting his hearers to identify with Noah in that situation. And I think in a very mysterious way, he's talking about the message that before the incarnation, Christ preaches through Noah in that spiritual realm. So it's in the spirit, and in the spiritual realm, Jesus is still operating, drawing people to himself through the preached word, through Noah's ministry.
Let's take a look at Dr. Erik's argument in this video. So the passage, we're talking about 1 Peter 3, 18 through 20, should first be read in light of Peter's main purpose. This is what he says, that Peter's goal is to encourage persecuted and discouraged believers to endure faithfully. And I completely agree. The entire point of 1 Peter 3, it's purely pastoral. Peter is teaching us how to endure. He goes on to say that the central point of the section is the gospel statement that Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring us to God, for those who would believe, that is. And again, I completely agree. That is the gospel-centric part of this passage. So Dr. Erik concludes at the whole end of his discussion by arguing that Peter's point is that Jesus preached through Noah to the reprobate of Noah's day, and that's where he starts to lose me. He removes the theological necessity of Christ's descent into hell, something that I think has been very important to the church fathers and to the church throughout history. So he thinks that interpretations that focus on Jesus going to hell sort of give people a second chance, and that misses Peter's main pastoral purpose. Well, I mean, I would agree if that were the natural inference of the passage. Dr. Erik is referring to something that is commonly called postmortem salvation, or salvation after death. And this is commonly considered heresy, or at least a grave error in most theological circles today. Hebrews 9:27 says, and I mentioned this earlier, that it is appointed for man to die, and after that comes to judgment. You get one life for which to bow to Christ. And I agree with that. I did find a limited view of postmortem salvation that is not for everyone in a couple of places in the church fathers. For example, Cyril of Alexandria and Augustine. Though Augustine thought it was only for those who drowned in the flood. In other words, that Christ went and said, hey, you get a second chance just for those who drowned in the flood. And Cyril seems to think it was for the reprobate who died before the incarnation. So anybody who died in Old Testament times, you could say, that Jesus went and proclaimed to them the gospel and gave them an opportunity to be saved. Neither of them, however, argued for everyone. I couldn't find a broad view of postmortem salvation that would suggest that even those who die outside of Christ today have an opportunity to enter into eternity in the kingdom of God. I could have missed something. I didn't go read the entire canon of the fathers in every language that they're available in to see where I could find this. I just went through some stuff that I sort of was already familiar with and things that I could search through in my Logos Bible software. So that's kind of what I did. So just, to be transparent. But this really is not a historical option of interpretation. Postmortem salvation isn't there. And so I'm not sure why Dr. Erik thinks that that's perhaps the alternative view to what he's suggesting. It's very fringe. It's not the most common among the fathers. The common view, as I understand it, is that of the harrowing of hell, that Christ went and proclaimed victory to the saints in Hades. He didn't go, notice the difference between postmortem salvation view, he didn't go to preach to the reprobate, he went to preach to the saints, to those who were waiting in Hades, and then he rose. Matthew 27:52 through 53, the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming up out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. We'll talk about this more, but that's kind of the idea, that he went down, he proclaimed victory, and they rose when he rose. Dr. Erik goes on to say that references to Noah are supposed to create a parallel between Noah and the suffering of Christians. That Noah represents a righteous minority who preached truth while facing opposition, mockery, and rejection. And I would just say absolutely. That's definitely why at least one of the reasons. I think Peter's bringing in a whole lot of Old Testament theology here, but it is one of the reasons that Peter mentions Noah. So then Peter wants believers, Christians, to see themselves in Noah's situation in some way. I mean, obviously we're not building arks. And then to remain faithful despite the persecution. And again, I completely agree. That's the pastoral point of the passage. But this affirmation, it doesn't explain what it means that Jesus proclaims to the spirits in prison. My concern is that somebody watches a video like this and goes, yeah, that's right, and because the gospel, and therefore they believe something else about the point of the passage. And that's a problem, because the proclamation of the spirits in prison should be understood differently. So then Dr. Erik says that preaching occurred in the Spirit, meaning that Christ was working through Noah's proclamation rather than physically descending into hell. And I think that's a stretch. I'd have to think about it more. But initially, I sort of have some Plato brain issues happening. That is, the philosopher Plato, and further Plotinus, who built on his work, they separate the body from the true self, which is the spirit. And that's not biblical metaphysics. So I'm not terribly fond. I'm not saying there's no time to think differently or compartmentalize people into different parts, to think about how we sort of operate internally as a living soul. But biblical metaphysics is not creating a natural or truest self out of part of what it means to be a human. And actually, again, it's the teaching of the Greeks and it's the teaching of many of the Gnostics. And so Peter is not suggesting that Jesus is merely in the Spirit when he speaks of Jesus' life in the Spirit, despite his physical death. Biblical metaphysics allows for spiritual beings to have some kind of corporality. We see angels taking on physical form, even to the point that they can be shown hospitality, which means that they eat and they, sit in chairs and things like that. They have some kind of corporality, just as physical beings, we believe this, have an incorporeality. We have a spiritual essence to us by nature that is not merely physical. And so we are physical, but we are also spiritual, and spiritual beings can also be somewhat corporeal. And so Dr. Erik argues that the emphasis is that Christ has always been active through the preached word. So again, you can see how he's creating a metaphysical sense of this passage that detaches from the physical. He says the preached word even before his earthly ministry, encouraging believers that their faithful witness matters despite opposition. Again, I sort of agree that there's a theological patterning there, that you get this from the scriptures all over. Covenant theology would have us to go see the proclamation of Christ throughout the Old Testament. Any form of biblical theology is looking for that to some degree, but not at the cost of the perspicuous and historical interpretation of the text, which is that Jesus descended into hell to raise the saints. That's what this passage is about. And these ideas are not mutually exclusive. People argue about this a lot today, but this wasn't obscure or difficult to the early church. I want to show you a couple of points. Let's just start with some of the creeds. In the Apostles' Creed, Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. This is an interesting one. That word hell there in the English is actually the word lowers in the Greek. And it's better understood as Hades, as in some other versions of the creed. And then on the third day, he rose again. You might compare this to Ephesians 4:9. This could be where this comes from in the scriptures, that he descended to the lowers. Paul writes, in saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he has also descended into the lower regions of the earth? That there is katoteros in the Greek, and the creed uses katotata, the lowest, where katoteros means the lower. They have the same basic meaning as far as how we understand this phrase in English. They're related terms, just slightly different in their formulation. And so, Paul says that Christ descended into the lower regions of the earth. The Athanasian Creed, so it's not just the Apostles' Creed, as if some other creed comes along to correct this. I don't fully affirm the Athanasian Creed. I think there's some developments that happened that I don't think belong to historical early Christianity. But anyway, you can see this hanging on there because he suffered for our salvation, it says. He descended to hell. He arose from the dead. What's interesting there is the word for hell in the Athanasian Creed. It says, descendit ad inferos in the Latin. And that word inferos, you kind of think, inferno, he descended into hell. And there is, that word inferno today in English, it's related to this idea of fire by association. But it's not really what the word means. Think about the word inferior. Inferior comes from inferos, because to be inferior is to be lower. That word inferos is actually sort of a synonym for katotata. It just means the lowers. And so he descended into the lowers, the lower parts of the earth, is the natural understanding of this. So not so much hell. And I make a little bit of a point about this because we always write hell in our translations, but when we think about the lowers, we should be thinking about, before the resurrection, when Jesus ascends to the lowers, he's not going to hell properly speaking, he is going to Hades or Sheol. And so that's why I kind of make a big deal about both in the Greek and in the Latin, this being the lowers, and in Paul, which is also the Greek. So there's other ancient voices, not just the creeds. The creeds have wide acceptability, but we see it in the church fathers. Tertullian on the soul writes, Christ descended into hell in order to acquaint the patriarchs and prophets with his redeeming mission. That's clearly the harrowing of the saints there. Now, Origen is kind of controversial, but I want you to see something interesting, because in his commentary on John, he writes this. If you know Origen, he's kind of known for spiritualizing things that are not to be spiritualized. He makes really weird connections, and so then a lot of his work is rejected, and he does that in this text, but then he assumes something universal. So watch this. So he says, if the passage about John the Baptist not being worthy to untie Jesus' shoes possesses a hidden meaning, right? So he's looking for a hidden meaning. That's part of his problem. But he says we ought not to pass over it. I think that the incarnation, when the Son of God takes on flesh and bones, is one of the shoes. And I don't even know what that means. And the descent into hell is the other. So he's kind of giving theological ideas to his shoes. It is said in Psalm 16, Origen continues, you will not leave my soul in hell. Okay. Origen, again, he's not considered reputable all the time, but I think it's noteworthy that he assumes a common interpretation of Jesus' descent into Hades. He puts it right up there next to the incarnation. He says Jesus' two shoes are the incarnation and his descent into Hades. I just think that's fabulous because he's using these two, what to him must have been universal truths of the early church in order to make his weird argument. But nonetheless, if they weren't universal truths of the church, we know that the incarnation is, and actually what I'm kind of trying to show you here is that the Harrowing of Hades is as well. And so he's right to reference Psalm 16, by the way. Origen goes there, saying, I know that you won't abandon my soul to Sheol, or he says to hell, because he's working in the Latin there. Now, Clement of Alexandria talks about this as well in his Adumbrations, also suggested a descent to hell, but he said they did not see his form, but they heard the sound of his voice. And so he's messing with the metaphysics of the image a little bit, which you probably know at this point I don't like. But really, he's putting the same principle. He's trying to explain what is the natural and perspicuous reading of the text. Jesus went to hell, and he's trying to figure out what that means metaphysically for him because he doesn't want to deny the natural inference of the text. And so he's like, well, maybe it's just the sound of his voice. And, I think that's nonsense, but I think it also points to this idea that the early church was reading this a certain way. And so what he's arguing with, saying it was just his voice, is the natural interpretation that it was all of Jesus. So let's wrap this up. Dr. Erik is right that the passage should be read in light of Peter's main purpose. Peter's goal is to encourage persecuted and discouraged believers to endure faithfully. I went through Peter just here a year or so ago with our church and preached through 1st and 2nd Peter, and that's what I preached is, endure faithfully to the end. But the encouragement is not anything to do with Noah preaching Christ before the time. The encouragement is that Jesus will not abandon you to Sheol. That's what Origen noted, referencing Psalm 16:10. That is the natural understanding. He will not leave you. When you die, he will not leave you in the grave. He will not leave you in Sheol. He will not leave you in Hades. And in fact, for us today, post-resurrection, we will not even go to Sheol, to Hades, or to hell if we are in Christ. And so we have this great hope that when we give up our final breath, that we look to heaven and the heavens open and we're received into heaven with Christ. And so that's the encouragement. That's what we need to encourage people with. That's the type of encouragement that is going to bring us faithfully to the end. And Jesus rescues us from the grave. It's the gospel. And we can't take it out of Peter's words here. So for me, I'm going to continue to affirm the creeds, to, that Jesus descended into the lower regions, to Hades, but he rose and the saints with him. And that's no matter how difficult the persecution is that comes, he will not abandon me. God bless. Christ is King, and that changes everything.